I know that many in our community would prefer me to do teaching every Shabbat morning, hand out a sheet and go through it, and we'll have a chance to look at a text later this morning, but I wanted very much to be very precise in my language this morning, and so instead of that teaching, I'm going to do what would be classically referred to as a sermon. And I really want to make sure I get the words right. We are in a tenuous moment, or as to use the much overused phrase, we're in a moment of inflection. There's a lot that's going on in the Middle East right now. This past Sunday, I sat glued to my television, having to remind myself regularly to breathe as we waited with extraordinary anticipation for the release of hostages. And we flipped back and forth between stations last Sunday, trying to figure out which channel would be offering the best footage so that we could see with our very own eyes the eyes of these young people being released. Before seeing them, we kept wondering what was the delay, what was going on. It was supposed to be at 9 o'clock, and the release didn't end up coming until nearly 2 hours later. We knew that Hamas had agreed to the deal, but we were never sure until the very last second that Hamas would actually go through with the release of these hostages. We knew they had agreed, but we also knew that that didn't mean anything. We knew the world was watching, but only Hamas cares about a public opinion when it comes to sympathy for them. So we waited, and finally there was some movement, and there were some indications that things were happening. Red Cross vans were en route, trucks of aid were on the move, Israeli military helicopters coming into view, and then the first sights of Romy, Daron, and Emily. They seem to have been walking of their own volition as they passed by a heavy Hamas military presence, as if to give them one more moment of terror before their release, and they could be rushed away. And then we would note that they would spend a week under medical and psychological evaluations in the embrace of their family. And collectively, we shed a tear of joy. We shed a tear of anger. We shed a tear of frustration, a tear of relief, a tear because of what we felt, of how we feel, of what to do, of what to say, a tear of confusion, of emotion. The October 7th war is coming to an end with a question mark. But is it? And then we repeated the same exact thing again this morning. We all wonder how many of the 95 hostages are alive. Within the first phase, will Hamas actually be letting go of all of those they promised? Will there be a phase 2? Will there be a phase 3? We're hearing rumors already, mutterings that there won't be. I guess it will all depend on how much capital Hamas is building, which leaves us wondering how much other activity will Hamas be engaged in. How much will they be able to consolidate their power in this initial moment? How many more recruits will they be able to enlist? How many bombs will they be able to build? How many more tunnels will they be able to dig while we wait for phases to unfold? I guess you can hear my pessimism this morning. While I'm incredibly grateful for the safe return of Romy and Daron and Emily, of Liri, Karina, Nama, and Daniela, I just feel so torn. I imagine the joy their parents and siblings are feeling, but it feels like we've just torn off the bandage too soon. I know we want to give air to the wound that is festering. Let it breathe in the air. But maybe it's too soon, and maybe the wound will become infected. You all remember that when Gilad Shalit was released, Yair's son Sinwar was one of the people who was given back in return. Yahya Sinwar was one of the architects of October 7th. And so we wonder what's going to happen with those who have been released. However, that's how negotiations go. And I remind you, we're just at the beginning of the negotiations. And there are many, many more stages to go. This week's Parashat teaches us about a negotiation, about the belief that the end result of a negotiation will lead to freedom and liberty and peace. This week we read the early stages, and this week we felt the early stages and the grief that comes along with the incredibly difficult task of building trust. So here's how I see it if you want to look along with me in your Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 361 and 362. 361 and 362 in your Eitz Chaim Chumash, we find ourselves now at that part of the story into the second plague. The first plague, of course, was blood. The second plague, of course, is frogs. And I'd like to refer to this section of my words this morning as an anatomy of negotiations. Making a pact with people you cannot trust. So first, Vayalu et hatzvardaim el eretz Mitzrayim, the frogs covered the land of Egypt. God covered all of Egypt with frogs. And even to their own suffering, the strangest thing happens. Pharaoh notes that he can get his magicians to do the very same trick. If you look in the text, verse 3. Vaya'alu et hatzvardaim al eretz Mitzrayim. They covered the land with frogs as well. It's a strange thing that happens. We knew it from the start that Pharaoh had magicians who could do tricks. We saw them cast their rods down that turned into a snake. We saw them take some water and turn it into blood. But now, Pharaoh does something extraordinary. You see, the first stage of negotiation is always a showing of force. And there's no question that God rains down frogs on the Egyptian people in a plague that is supposed to discourage them. And then Pharaoh says, I could do the same thing. Without regard for the pain and suffering of his own people, he has his magicians rain down frogs on themselves. Vayikra Paro leMoshe u'Aaron vayomer hetiru et Adonai ve'aser hatzvardaim mimenu ume'amei ve'ashlecha ta'am ve'yisbechu l'Adonai. And then Pharaoh sees the suffering is horrible. And he says, fine, I'll let your people go. I'll let them go do their sacrifices to God, knowing that you'll come back. And then the response to the suffering. Pharaoh understands that God has more power than he, that he will be able to overwhelm them. And he says, you have triumphed over me. So I plead on behalf of my people, on behalf of my courtiers, that the frogs be removed. The show of force worked. And even Pharaoh comes to recognize the suffering he has himself inflicted on his own. And then he says to God and Moses and Aaron, please remove this plague. And then something really interesting happens in the text. Rak b'yaor te'ishena. God removes the plague of frogs from the whole land of Egypt, but rak b'yaor. He leaves them in the Nile. As if a little reminder that at any moment it's possible to return the troops. There has to be some confidence-building measure. Yes, the removal of frogs, but there has to also be an understanding that we trust but verify. Make sure that we leave a force in place to ensure the progress of the negotiations. And then verse 8. Vayetze Moshe ve'Aaron me'im Paro. And Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to Adonai about the frogs and the suffering. And God did what Moses had asked. The frogs died out. They retreated. And then verse 11 happens exactly as we knew it was going to happen, as it's happened time and time again. Remember, you've read the story already. You know how it ends. You know the interim stages to getting to that end place, but we see verse 11 nonetheless. And we read it in light of the negotiations that we see this past week. And we see how they unfolded this morning, in which one of the people on the list did not come. And so the negotiations had a setback this morning, because as soon as Pharaoh realized what he had allowed to happen, he regretted it. In verse 11, it says, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them as God had spoken. Pharaoh says, look, things are back to normal. Things are good. I don't need to fulfill my end of the bargain entirely. It's no surprise that Pharaoh goes back on his word. We're told from the very beginning of the story that Pharaoh will have a hardened heart. It's no surprise to readers of the story. We know there are going to be more plagues. There's going to be more suffering to come. What's surprising is they think that this deal will change the landscape of the Middle East. What's surprising to me are those pundits on television who say there's a sea change occurring. We've watched as the Abraham Accords unfold. We've seen the toppling of the Assad regime in Syria and Hezbollah relinquishing control in Lebanon. We've watched the further isolation of Iran, and we have also watched the fall of the USSR, only to see Putin invade Ukraine. We know how the story ends. There are plenty of examples of democracy, freedom, and human rights victories. There are many examples of liberty overcoming evil. And we pray that this is, in fact, that sea change. Maybe this is the moment that is the precursor to an age of a messianic dawning. Maybe this is the moment in which we see peace overcomes war. Unfortunately, the world has seen far too many false messiahs. So today, I say to you, as much as I say to myself, Od lo avda tikvatenu, we can never let our sense of hope die. Od lo avda tikvatenu, we cannot ever give up on hope of peace, of joy, of gladness, of triumph, of good over evil. We can never let our hope be destroyed. I tell you, it is so hard watching the faces of these hostages being released. It is so hard to watch the mothers embrace their daughters, knowing how many are still left behind enemy lines, living through 15 months of hell alongside our brothers and sisters in Israel. It's hard to hold on to hope. Having seen so many die, it's hard to live and hold on to hope. But as a Jewish people, we have no other choice. We know how the story ends. It's difficult to imagine that the future will be better. But we know that slavery of the Jewish people in Egypt ended. We know that we now have a relatively good peace with the land of Egypt. It ends in that story with victory. Look, we know there are battles ahead. There are always Amaleks that arise in every generation. But we also know how the story really ends, and that is we land in the land of Israel triumphant. Shabbat Shalom. Page 184, please rise.